You stopped forcing life. Not as a gesture, not as a declaration, not as something anyone else could notice, but as an internal rupture, quietly definitive. The moment you realized that pushing harder was no longer moving anything forward, only draining you faster, tightening your bud, narrowing your thinking, and convincing you that urgency was the same as responsibility. This pattern did not begin today. It has been running for years, expressed in how quickly you respond, how automatically you explain yourself, how uncomfortable you feel when something remains unresolved, and how often you act not because each is aligned, but because stillness creates pressure inside you. You recognize each in the body before the thought forms, the subtle agitation, the restless energy, the internal voice that insists something must be done immediately, even when real decision is required, even when waiting would cost less than reacting. Each time you follow that impulse, the relief is brief, almost imperceptible, and the cost is permanent, because clarity fades first, then patience, then the ability to choose cleanly, until reaction becomes your default posture. Exhaustion starts to feel normal. You told yourself this was discipline, that staying active meant staying in control, that constant movement proved commitment, but what it actually proved was fear. Fear of silence, fear of uncertainty, fear of allowing life to move you without your interference. Nothing dramatic needed to happen for this to become unsustainable. The damage accumulated quietly, through small concessions, rushed decisions, softened boundaries, in the habit of prioritizing immediate relief over long-term coherence. The pressure you feel now is not new, it is simply no longer masked, because the cost has crossed our threshold, and what once felt manageable now feels heavy, repetitive, and internally dishonest. This is not about circumstances changing, because the circumstances were never the core issue. The issue has always been the reflex, the automatic response that keeps you busy, tense, and reactive, while convincing you that you are doing the right thing. The pattern sustains itself without effort. It feeds on urgency, rewards impulsivity, and punishes pause, and as long as it runs unchecked, it will continue charging you energy, focus, and self-respect, even on days when nothing goes wrong. There is no external force keeping this alive, no one pushing you into it, no event required to trigger it. It continues simply because it has never been interrupted with clarity. Either you stop financing this reflex consciously, or it keeps billing you quietly, through lost attention, diluted decisions, in the slow erosion of internal authority. Nothing that follows will comfort you. Nothing it will suit or explain away the discomfort. This moment only asks one thing: whether you are ready to stop paying for this same reaction, or willing to keep sustaining a pattern that has already shown you its cost. You keep calling each effort, but each is repetition. The same reaction, the same urgency, the same pressure to fix everything now. And each time you do it, you pay, not with results, with energy. This pattern feels active, responsible, even mature, but each is driven by fear, not clarity. Fear of losing control, fear of missing timing, fear that if you stop pushing, everything collapses. That fear is expensive. The illusion is simple. You believe intensity equals progress. You believe pressure equals commitment. You believe forcing life proves seriousness. None of that is true. It only proves tension. Look at the cost. Shorter patience, narrower judgment, decisions made to relieve anxiety, not to build direction. This is not discipline. This is impulse wearing a serious face. Stoic thinking cuts it, not softly, precisely. If your reaction repeats in the outcome does not change, the problem is not effort. It is orientation. You are pushing from the wrong place. This is not about slowing the for comfort. It is about stopping the leak. When action comes from agitation, it drains you before it moves you. And drained people make short-term choices. Notice the loop. Urgency creates noise. Noise creates mistakes. Mistakes create more urgency. You stay busy. You do not move forward. Breaking this is not dramatic. It is sober. You stop confusing motion with progress. You stop rewarding yourself for the stress. You start noticing where force replaces thought. This is the first catch. Seeing that your automatic response is the cost itself, not the solution. If you do not interrupt it, nothing else matters. What drains you is not the situation itself, but the automatic internal sequence that activates before you even notice. The impulse to react immediately, the anxiety of unresolved space, the quiet need to restore certainty so fast that clarity never enters the room. This mechanism feels personal, but each is mechanical. Urgency appears, tension rises, validation becomes tempting. Inaction follows not because each is correct, but because silence inside you feels intolerable. Relief becomes more important than direction. You mistake this pressure for responsibility, yet each is fear dressed as discipline. The fear of losing relevance, of missing timing, of being seen as passive. In that fear forces movement before evaluation, locking you into responses that repeat rather than resolve. Nothing it requires explanation or theory, it only requires honesty. Every time you act from inner agitation, you trade long-term coherence for short-term relief. In the body remembers this cost long before the mind admits it. This is where most people collapse quietly, not because they lack strength, but because they keep feeding the same internal trigger, hoping a different outcome will appear, while the pattern remains untouched and unchallenged. The shift begins the moment you see the mechanism without justifying it. Impulse is not intuition, anxiety is not urgency, and movement is not progress, and until you separate these, you will keep paying for speed with stability. This is not about becoming cold, distant, or unresponsive. It is about ending the habit of negotiating with impulse, because every time you debate urgency instead of deciding from values, you reinforce the pattern that drains you. You call it flexibility. The Stoic decision is simply uncomfortable. You stop outsourcing your sentir to emotional pressure. You choose coherence over relief, and you accept that clarity sometimes feels heavier than reaction, because it removes excuses and leaves you fácil with responsibility. You are not suppressing emotion you are placing it in its proper position. Emotion informs, it does not command. And when you stop letting discomfort dictate timing, your actions begin to align instead of scatter. This decision costs you something immediately: the illusion of control, the false comfort of doing something fast, the familiar identity of the one who always responds, explains, fixes, and smooths everything, even when it erodes self-respect. But what you gain is structural. You act less, but each action carries weight. You speak less, but your words stop leaking. A silence becomes a conscious boundary, not a tactic, not a test, simply a choice rooted in self-care. For me, you no longer ask what will calm the moment, you ask what will preserve consistency tomorrow. And that single question quietly rearranges everything that follows. Execution begins where explanation ends, because clarity is not proven through speech but through alignment. In the moment you stop narrating your choices to feel safe, your actions start carrying weight instead of noise, which is uncomfortable at first but structurally necessary. This phase is not dramatic. There are no announcements, no emotional speeches, no symbolic gestures meant to convince yourself or anyone else that something has changed. Because real execution does not ask for witnesses, it asks for consistency under pressure. You pause before responding, not to create suspense, but to regain authorship over timing. You answer with clarity, or you choose not to answer at all, not as avoidance, but as a boundary that protects your energy from being consumed by repetition. You stop explaining yourself, because explanation has become a reflex, not a necessity. Each unnecessary explanation has been teaching your nervous system that your decisions require permission, approval, or validation to exist. Your routine becomes non-negotiable. Sleep, work, movement, silence. These are not luxuries, they are stabilizers. When you protect them, your internal state stops swinging according to external stimuli. This execution feels minimal on the outside, but internally it is demanding, because it removes the emotional shortcuts you used to rely on. Reacting fast, fixing quickly, smoothing discomfort. It replaces them with restraint, which initially feels like a loss. The temptation, it is subtle. You will want to justify your restraint, to explain that you are being intentional, mature, reasonable, but that is the old pattern trying to survive, because if you explain, you reopen negotiation. Execution without justification here is posture. You do less, but you stand firmer. You engage less, but you stay present. And this consistency begins to calm the internal noise that once pushed you into constant motion. Nothing about this is passive. It is precise. Each action is chosen. Each pause is deliberate. Each boundary is maintained not to provoke reaction, but to prevent self-abandonment. You will notice resistance, not from others, but from inside. The impulse to prove value, to clarify intentions, to smooth tension. In every time you do not follow that impulse, you strengthen the muscle that keeps your life coherent. This is where execution becomes identity, not something you perform once, but something you repeat daily, quietly, until each stop is feeling like effort and starts feeling like structure. The real test is not external, it never arrives as a confrontation or a clear moment of choice, it appears quietly, as an urge, a familiar tension in the body, a thought that says you should say something now, clarify now, prove something now, before the moment slips away. This is where most reversals fail, not because the decision was wrong, but because the impulse was underestimated. The need to send a message, to explain your silence, to restore balance quickly, disguises itself as maturity, while each is still the same anxiety asking for relief. The temptation feels rational, even responsible. You tell yourself that clarity requires action, that silence creates confusion, that doing nothing is avoidance. But what you are really negotiating with is discomfort, not values, and discomfort always argues convincingly. De hoje to prove value resurface zero. Quietly, you want to show that you are reasonable, present, fair, emotionally available, because the old identity was built around being accessible, responsive, dependable, even when each cost you stability. Another test emerges as comparison. You start measuring yourself against imagined timelines, against what others seem to be doing, feeling, achieving, and suddenly your calm feels slow, your restraint feels like a delay, and pressure builds to catch up emotionally. These tests do not mean you are failing, they mean the pattern is losing ground, because habits fight hardest when they are no longer in control. The impulse does not disappear politely, it tries to reclaim authority through urgency. The danger is subtle. You may believe one exception will not matter, one message, one explanation, one emotional reach, just to clear the air. But exceptions are how patterns survive. They re-enter through small permissions. Stoic discipline yet is not suppression, it is observation. You notice the urge, you name each internally. You feel each fully without acting on each. You allow the discomfort to pass without turning each into behavior. This moment trains something deeper than willpower. It teaches your nervous system that tension is survivable, that silence does not equal loss, that not acting immediately does not destroy you, even when every instinct says otherwise. Each time you hold this line, something recalibrates, the urge weakens, the pause lengthens, and your decisions start coming from stability instead of reflex, which is how consistency is built. The test repeats many times, over days, over weeks, because patterns are persistent, but each repetition handled cleanly reduces their grip. What once felt unbearable becomes manageable. This is not about winning against impulse, it is about outlasting it, letting each exhaust itself, while you remain grounded, because impulse feeds on reaction. When reaction disappears, it loses fuel. By staying consistent you stop training your mind to panic at discomfort, and start training it to trust structure, in that shift is irreversible once established. At first, consistency feels artificial, like something you are forcing yourself to maintain, because your system was trained on reaction and urgency, not on steadiness. And when the noise reduces, the silence feels unfamiliar rather than peaceful. Days pass where nothing dramatic happens, no crisis, no resolution, no clear reward. And this is exactly where the old pattern tries to convince you that nothing is working, because each was addicted to intensity as proof of progress. What is actually happening is quieter. Your nervous system starts recalibrating, your baseline lowers, emotional spikes soften, and you begin to notice that fewer situations trigger the same internal scramble that once felt automatic and unavoidable. You are no longer negotiating every impulse, because many of them stop reaching the surface with the same force, not due to suppression, but because they are no longer being rewarded with action, explanation, or emotional discharge. Consistency does not announce itself as confidence, it shows up as fewer internal debates, fewer rehearsed messages in your head, fewer moments where you abandon your priorities to manage discomfort that does not actually require management. This phase tests patience in a different way, not through temptation, but through monotony, because stability can feel boring to a system that was conditioned to equate chaos with aliveness and urgency with purpose. You may question whether you are becoming indifferent, less engaged, less driven, but what is actually happening is differentiation. You are separating what matters from what merely stimulates, and that distinction restores clarity. Your routines start holding you instead of being interrupted by mood. You protect sleep, work, movement, and focus, not because someone told you to, but because you directly experience the cost when you do not. Emotional reactions still occur, but they no longer dictate behavior automatically. You feel frustration, disappointment, or uncertainty, and yet your actions remain aligned with long-term coherence rather than short-term relief. This is where respect for yourself deepens, not through affirmation, but through evidence. You see yourself choosing consistency even when it would be easier to break it. And that builds trust internally. Trust changes how you move through decisions. You stop rushing to close emotional loops. You allow situations to remain unresolved without interpreting that as failure. Your sense of identity becomes less dependent on immediate outcomes. Weeks into this posture, something stabilizes, not happiness, not certainty, but reliability. You become someone who does not abandon structure under pressure. And that reliability becomes your internal reference point. You are no longer waiting till feel calm to act correctly. You act correctly and calm follows, not as a reward, but as a natural byproduct of coherence maintained over time. This consolidation is not visible to others and does not need to be, because its function is not to impress, but to protect you from slipping back into patterns that cost more than they give. Consistency becomes normal, not heroic. When steadiness replaces effort, your energy stops leaking through emotional cracks that once felt inevitable. You do not feel transformed in a dramatic way. You feel grounded, and that grounded state quietly changes the quality of every decision you make from this point forward. At this stage, the result is no longer something you wait for. It is something you inhabit, because the true consequence of this process was never external resolution, recognition, or response, but the stabilization of your internal position under pressure. You notice that peace is no longer fragile. It does not depend on timing, replies, reassurance, or control. It holds even when things remain unfinished, uncertain, or imperfect, which is how you know it is real and not borrowed. Respect for yourself stops being an idea, it becomes a lived pattern. You choose differently without announcing it. You protect your limits without dramatizing them. You no longer need constant confirmation to stay aligned with your decisions. The absence of urgency becomes the clearest signal of change. Situations that once hijacked your attention now pass through with less friction, not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped identifying with every emotional fluctuation. You act with intention instead of reaction. You communicate when each is coherent. You remain silent when clarity requires each. In neither choice carries guilt, explanation, or second-guessing, because both are grounded in self-respect. What stabilizes it is not confidence in outcomes, but confidence in process. You trust how you respond to difficulty. You trust your capacity to hold discomfort without collapsing into old behaviors, and that trust replaces anxiety. You experience fewer internal conflicts, not because life became simpler, but because you stopped fighting reality where each cannot be controlled. You redirected your effort to what actually belongs to you: posture, choice, consistency. The mind becomes quieter, not empty, but ordered. Thoughts still arise, emotions still pass, yet they no longer dictate identity or action automatically, which restores a sense of authorship you may not have felt in years. This is the sustainable result: less self-betrayal, fewer impulsive repairs, more alignment between what you value and how you behave. Even when the environment remains unstable or unresolved, there is no euphoria, no dramatic sense of victory, only a grounded clarity that tells you can continue, you can decide, and you can remain intact without forcing life to comply with your expectations. You stop measuring success by relief and start measuring it by coherence, by how little energy is wasted managing what does not require management, and how much becomes available for what truly matters. This outcome does not shout, it settles. It does not impress, it protects. And once established, it becomes the standard you are unwilling to abandon, because you know the cost of living without it. This is no longer a process unfolding, it is a position already taken, because the internal shift did not arrive with noise or resistance. It settled quietly the moment you stopped negotiating with impulse and began acting from coherence without needing reinforcement, approval, or confirmation. Silence now exists as structure, not as strategy, not as avoidance, and not as a signal meant to produce any effect outside of you, but as a clear internal alignment where nothing needs to be said because nothing is being questioned anymore. Your stability does not depend on resolution, response, or outcome, It holds even when situations remain open, unfinished, or uncertain, because this center of gravity has moved inward and no longer swings according to external movement. What changed is not intensity but orientation. You no longer organize yourself around urgency, reaction, or emotional pressure, and it alone removes the friction that once drained you without you noticing. You are not withholding, waiting, or proving anything. You are simply no longer available for patterns that required you to abandon yourself to maintain momentum, connection, or control. And that decision now sustains itself without effort. There is no tension in this posture, no performance, no hidden objective, because you are not trying to demonstrate strength. You are inhabiting it, quietly, consistently, without commentary. The mind is calmer not because life became easier, but because you stopped fighting what cannot be controlled and redirected attention toward what belongs entirely to you: choice, boundary, execution, and rhythm. Nothing it needs to be defended or justified, because clarity does not ag, it stands. And once coherence replaces reaction, there is nothing left to negotiate internally. You do not feel elevated or victorious, you feel settled. In that settled state removes the need to hash, explain, or correct what does not require your intervention. This is where the cycle closes, not with a statement, but with a stabilized internal position where nothing is missing, nothing is chased, and nothing needs to change to confirm what is already established. If this posture reflects where you are, subscribe to the channel to stay aligned with this standard of clarity. Share this message with someone who values responsibility over reaction. Activate notifications to remain anchored in consistency, and use super thanks as a symbolic reinforcement of your own commitment to acting from coherence rather than impulse.